Tonight, Dr. Plague reads Lisa. Enjoy. Good afternoon, beautiful. Paul had rushed home from work, just like he had every day for the past 2 weeks. Reagan and Frank had said something about drinks after their shift, but he'd barely heard them. He had only one thought on his mind, the same thing he had for the past 2 weeks. Lisa. Man, you're falling way too hard for this gal, Frank had told him, as he made the usual excuses. You don't even know what she looks like, he added, before Paul could make his escape. Sure I do, Paul protested, and turned to go. 5'5", 100 pounds even. Long brown hair, B-cup with mossy green eyes, and a love of classical music. Reagan had scoffed. I didn't ask what her profile said, man. He'd rolled his eyes and took another puff off his cigarette. I asked if you knew what she looked like. She looks like an angel, boys, and this angel's waiting for me. And with that, he'd been off. He'd rushed home through 2 blocks of busy Chicago streets to sink happily into his chair and find her online. Lisa. Just saying her name made his heart race. Lisa had found him, actually sought him out after reading something he'd posted on a forum. They started talking, and from day one it seemed like they had known each other for years. It seemed as though years themselves had passed by while she was with him, though it could have been seconds. Nothing else mattered when she was online. He went to bed later and later each night, not wanting to stop talking to her for a second. And strangely, she didn't seem to mind at all. She was as smitten with him as he was with her. A perfect match. Hi, Polly. Rough day today? She was so cute. After 2 weeks, Paul had been hard-pressed to find anything he didn't like about her. The way she called him Polly, the way she always asked about his day, the way she always remembered important things he'd told her, even when he couldn't, the way her words seemed to smile at him. She was something he'd always wanted. She was everything he'd always wanted. Much better now that you're here, Lisa, he said. Aw, you're such a teaser. I've been waiting for my Polly all day, and now I finally have you. You sure do. I'm all yours, baby. The scream of the alarm clock brought him back to reality. It had been such a good night last night, but now it was time for another fun-filled day of work. Last night, just thinking about it made his heart race again. They had talked till almost dawn. He'd only stopped when his eyes had gotten heavy and finally betrayed him. She was a technician, his Lisa. She just kept on talking, kept on laughing, only wanting more of him. He felt his face redden as he lurched into the kitchen and turned on the tiny television by the counter. A man in a gray suit was pointing at a weather map and talking about the weekend weather as Paul poured milk on his sugar flakes. The man was finishing up his report as Paul leaned against the counter, and the camera turned back to a bubbly young woman and a middle-aged man dressed in a similar gray suit. For those of you just joining us, our top story remains the murder of the mayor and his wife early this morning. Police responded to screams in the early morning hours and found both victims stabbed multiple times. Though the murder weapon, like much else about the murder, has not been released, police have said that they have a suspect in custody. Pretty unsettling stuff, wouldn't you say, Megan? The bubbly brown-haired woman on his side nodded fervently. Unsettling indeed. The murders come just a week after the mayor's inflammatory remarks concerning the rights of ID workers after their second week on strike. He was a firm opponent of artificial rights but Paul turned it off and put the empty bowl in the sink. The news was so depressing these days. People being murdered in their own homes, these damn ID workers thinking they could demand rights all of a sudden, and to top it all off, there was so much anti-ID sentiment that the city was becoming a melting pot of chaos. At least I've got my Lisa. The struggles of the world don't mean much as long as I've got her, he said to himself. Paul beamed all the way to work. He passed other people on the street, making their way to work, home, or wherever they were going this time of morning. He didn't care. He was on cloud 9. He just really didn't have time to pay any more attention. He had a checklist of things he needed to get done today, and as he rounded 8th Street and proceeded to Wellington, he ticked them off. He had a meeting at 1 to prepare for. He'd be introducing his product findings for the quarter. Then at 3, he had his next quarter numbers to send to the boss. Then it was home to spend his evenings in the virtual embrace of Lisa. Somewhere along the way, he'd see his friends, have lunch, pick up dinner, but that too seemed secondary next to the idea of talking to Lisa. He sighed, wishing it were 3 already. There was a big crowd outside when he arrived, and he could see police tape across the doors. Mr. Marshall, the office director, was talking loudly to a uniformed man, and several officers were carrying out computers, taking fingerprints, removing fragments from the door. Paul slid in next to Frank. As usual, Reagan was late, but it didn't look like anyone would be getting any work done today. "What happened?" Paul asked in a hushed voice, as one of the officers brought a filing cabinet out on a hand dolly. "Seems there was a break-in last night," said Frank, making no effort to keep his voice low. "A break-in? What could anybody possibly want in our office? I mean, we sell computer chips. We don't even keep them on site." "No clue," said Frank, as Reagan slid in next to him. A blonde woman, Paul thought her name was Frances, leaned back and said in a low voice, "Agnes was the first person in this morning. She said the front door to the Human Resource Office was destroyed, and 2 filing cabinets were wrenched open. She thinks they were after files or something." Paul's brow creased as he contemplated the mystery that had suddenly and possibly led to him not having to work today. He smiled a little to himself, thinking that sounded like a pretty good day to him. "And so they gave us the rest of the day off, and tomorrow, with pay. That's wonderful, Polly. I'm glad you got some time to rest after such a stressful week." They had been talking all morning. As lunchtime came around, Paul's stomach made a low, pitiful rumble. He ignored it, though. This was right where he wanted to be. As it rumbled again, though, an idea began to form. "Stomach's trying to tear me away from you," he commented offhandedly. "Oh, do you need to get some lunch?" "Well, actually, I was hoping you'd maybe meet me somewhere. Maybe Gabriel's on 7th? They make a mean hoagie." The message hung for a couple of minutes. "My treat," he added, not liking the silence. I don't know, Polly," she finally said after a few more seconds of silence. "Lisa, if I'm being honest, I like you, and I would like to take our relationship to a more 3-dimensional level. Won't you please consider a date with me?" She hesitated before responding. "I'm sorry, Polly. I'm just not ready yet. There are things about myself I'm not quite comfortable with. I can't face you. Not yet, Polly. Just be patient with me. I'm new to this kind of thing." Polly sighed. "You're a girl worth waiting for, Lisa. A girl as pretty as you can take their time." "Oh, Polly, you always know just what to say to make a girl smile." "So, Paul, how's that lady of yours?" Paul kept his eyes on his computer. This document had to be finished before he left at 3. The break-in had been a week ago, but the office was still trying to get back into their usual routine. "Fine," he said, returning to typing. "So, when's the first date?" Frank asked as he stirred lazily at his coffee. He'd been getting pretty nosy after the break-in, and his questions were becoming suffocating. Between Frank and Reagan, he was lucky to get a moment's peace. They were continuously asking him out for drinks or to stop by unannounced to hang out, which seemed to entail keeping him off the computer and squarely in the real world. He was already irritable from the lack of sleep, and he really didn't need this today. He couldn't say why, but he was sure someone had been on the fire escape last night. He'd woken up several times to a shadow cast across his bed and the foreboding feeling of being watched. The shadow would move as soon as he tried to see what it was, until finally he'd slept facing away from the window and hadn't been bothered for the rest of the night. His conversations with Lisa had gotten more involved as well, to his great joy. The intimacy of the questions often made him blush, and she seemed ravenous to know everything about him. The minutest details seemed to only stoke the flames of her curiosity, and Paul felt giddy as she shared more of herself with him. Meetings, however, remained a shaky bit of ground. "We haven't set one," he said curtly as he continued about his business. It was getting late, nearly 3, and his work wasn't done. He'd have to stay late to finish, and that was precious time that he couldn't spend with Lisa. "Geez, Paul, you've been talking to this gal for a month now, and you still haven't met her?" I don't recall asking your opinion on my relationship, Frank. Paul snapped and instantly felt ashamed. Sorry. I'm just tired. I didn't sleep well last night again. He didn't dare tell anyone about the shadow. People would think he was nuts. It's fine, buddy. I can tell you're hurting for sleep. I just don't want to see you get burned, you know? These gals online find a nice guy like you and they bleed him dry, Paul. Can we change the subject? Paul begged. Frank nodded, taking the hint. You hear about the disappearance of that scientist from the facility? Of course Paul had. It was all over the news. They think now that the ID might have been involved. You know, our company had something to do with them in the first place. So maybe they think we need a little revenge on our own. Paul was about to say this really wasn't a topic for work when the clock struck 3 and Paul happily filed his report away and turned his computer off for the night. Another fun-filled evening with your make-believe lady, Frank asked, and Paul pulled his windbreaker on over his work shirt. Lisa's a real person, Frank. I wish you could see her the way I do sometimes. Then maybe you'd stop with all these stupid questions. Frank scoffed. Make sure you get some sleep, buddy. You look kind of beat. Thanks, Mom, Paul said, as he threw his messenger bag over his shoulder and headed for the door. As he neared his apartment, Paul saw an unfamiliar woman near the mailboxes. She was bent at the knee, reading the names on the mailboxes through squinted eyes. Her long brown hair tumbled down her back, and she was dressed simply in a green t-shirt and cut-off jeans. She was gorgeous by anyone's standards, and she was receiving a good number of stares from the passersby. Paul realized with embarrassment that he was one of them. He shook himself out of his daze. Lisa would be waiting for him. As he walked towards the door, though, the woman straightened suddenly and looked at him oddly. Polly? She said excitedly. Lisa? The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. Subconsciously, he had known it was her, but he hadn't dared to hope it could be true. She hugged him briefly, and he returned the gesture. Her arms were certainly firm for someone so small, he thought, as she crushed him against her. She definitely wasn't as big a homebody as he'd thought, and he reflected that making her mad might be a bad idea. It's so nice to finally meet you in person. I mean, I was worried when I couldn't find your name on the mailboxes. Paul could only look at her with astonishment. She was here. She was finally here. Her hands were in his. Her voice was like honey poured over a sonnet. Her hair tumbled easily down the back of her neck in warm, thick sheets. Her eyes seemed to smile at him from under her bangs. She was a vision, a goddess. Paul could feel the blood pumping in his ears as she spoke. The edges of his world were blurring. Paul, is everything okay? He sighed, clearing the butterflies from his stomach. I'm just so surprised you're here. She smiled and placed a delicate finger to her cheek, crooking the other under her chin. Is it a good surprise? She asked coyly. He grinned. The best. Are you sure I can't make you something to eat? Paul had easily made enough pasta for 5 people, let alone 2. His attention had been elsewhere, on that perfect goddess that sat in his dining room. She seemed drawn to him too, never looking away, never tiring of his face, as he stood there at the stove, cooking the only dish he knew. Bachelor life was tough, but spaghetti was easy. Oh, no, it's fine. I already ate before I came, she said quickly. Paul spun his fork absent-mindedly as she continued to stare at him. He popped a roll of spaghetti in his mouth and gasped. It was hot. The noodles burned the roof of his mouth suddenly, and his hands groped for his wineglass. She giggled, and he took a long sip as he grimaced at the bitter taste of cheap wine. Do I distract you that much? She asked innocently. Paul grinned sheepishly. Kind of a lot. I hate to think you had to walk all the way here just to see me. You should tell me next time, and I'll... He remembered something then. Well, I guess I won't be able to walk you here since I don't think you've ever told me where you live. No, it's fine. I don't mind. Any excuse to see you, she purred as she dodged the question. They both blushed, and Paul took another bite of spaghetti. His heart was pounding. What was she doing here? Not that he wasn't pleased to see her after a month of conversations, but a woman like this could have any man she wanted. Why would she settle for a lowly cubicle jockey like me, he thought. So, did you find the place okay? He asked, hoping to break the silence. Oh yeah, it was quite a nice walk. I'm jealous you get to see this every day at work. The The stores are likely just opening when you head out, and I can only imagine what kind of smells and sounds you must hear. Paul took another bite and then another as she spoke. When had he told her where he worked? Or for that matter, where he lived? He tried to remember as she went on and on about the scenery, but he just couldn't remember. His face must have said more than he meant it to, because she looked at him and asked, "What are you thinking about so hard, Polly?" And then it was all gone. She laid her fingers across her cheek again and cocked her head just so, and he was putty in her hands. "Oh, nothing. Thought maybe we could watch a movie. I hope you have something romantic," she said, with a little giggle. So she just showed up out of the blue. "That's right," Paul said, triumphant. He'd met Frank and Reagan for lunch at one of the sports bars near his apartment. They'd wanted to watch the Bears play, and neither was well stocked for food at their place. The sports bar was packed, likely more Bear fans, and the noise was deafening. It was so surreal. She just showed up, out of the blue, and stayed with me all night. He could feel his face turning red, but couldn't let them see. "All night, huh?" Reagan said with a grin. Paul laughed. "Not like that. We just sort of sat around and enjoyed each other's company." "Uh-huh," said Reagan, unconvinced. Frank seemed thoughtful, though, so she just showed up. Paul looked at him. "Yeah? Funny. Thought you said she was nervous about meeting you." "I guess she got over it," Paul said with a shrug. "Funny how you never mentioned switching addresses with this mystery girl." Paul furrowed his brow. "That's right, yeah. Come to think of it, I didn't remember giving her my address. I suppose I must have forgotten, though. We've been talking for months. It was bound to come up." "And your work, too? Did that come up all of a sudden?" A chill ran down Paul's spine. "Now that you mention it, hey, what's with the third degree here, Frank? Doesn't strike you as odd that this girl just showed up out of the blue without being invited and without being told where you live or where you work? This is Chicago, Paul. Do you have any idea what the chances of meeting someone at a specific time and place with no clue where that place is are? 1 in a million, just like this girl," Paul chuckled. "Be serious, Paul. You may think this is endearing, but we have a word for people like that, and it's called stalker. But he faltered as a shadow fell across the table. Paul looked up and into the wet, moss-colored eyes of his angel. Lisa was there, carrying a glass of beer and wearing a Bears jersey. She had obviously heard the conversation. Paul barely got her name out before she was running for the door of the crowded bar, beer crashing to the floor in a foamy wave. "Lisa, wait! Lisa!" Paul was on his feet and after her in a second. He pushed through the crowd of people, most cursing and shouting in his wake, but as he exited to the street, he found no trace of Lisa. "No," he sobbed, grabbing the building for support. She was gone. She'd run away from him, and now he'd never see her again. His stomach felt like he'd swallowed a hot brick. Tears came unbidden to his eyes. "Dude, I'm sorry," said Frank. I didn't mean to." Paul didn't remember slipping it to the ground, but Frank's hand was reaching for him, and he slapped it away angrily. "Next time, why don't you just keep your goddamn mouth shut?" he shouted as he lurched to his feet and began running for his apartment. Paul sighed as he walked home after another busy day at the office. It had been 5 days. 5 days since his fight with Frank. 5 days since he'd seen Lisa's tear-streaked face. She hadn't been online at all. No emails or visits either, and Paul was beginning to worry that he would never see her again. She had looked so upset at the bar, he wondered if she truly thought he believed Frank's suspicions. Frank. There was another mystery. No one had seen or heard from Frank since Saturday. He hadn't shown up to work all week, and Reagan said there was no answer at his apartment. As mad as Paul had been at Frank for his ill-timed outburst, he couldn't pretend he wasn't worried about him. They had been friends for years, and his disappearance was more than a little unsettling with all the ID intolerance going on. Paul sighed as his key scraped the lock. What was he going to do? He'd lost his best friend and the love of his life in one fell swoop. The red light was blinking on his machine when he got home, and when he pressed it, the voice he expected to hear wasn't there. "Polly, it's Lisa. I know I have a lot to answer for, but I was wondering if you'd like to come over so I can try to explain what's been going on." Her address followed, along with some directions. Paul listened to the message 4 times, drinking in the sound of her voice, and there was hurt in it that almost brought Paul to tears. They made him feel guilty as he left his apartment and trekked the familiar path downtown. Lisa lived in a large brick building in one of the nicer parts of the city. He found her apartment easily, and when he knocked, a little voice told him to come in. As he entered, he couldn't help but notice the long red streak up the floor. Paul had never seen blood, but he'd seen enough cop dramas to know what the start of a crime scene looks like. A chill swept over him as he entered. She was sitting on the couch, a fire burning in the grate. She turned to look at him, and her angelic face was a welcome sight. As she spread her arms wide and ran to him, Paul was surprised that he didn't cringe away from her, especially since her hands were caked in blood. "I'm so sorry, Paul. I'm sorry for everything, but it's okay now. No one will stop us from being together." Paul saw over her shoulder that the red streak led to the nearby bathroom, and the bottom fell out of his stomach. "Lisa, what have you done?" Her face clouded up, and tears appeared in the corners of her eyes. "I had to, Paul. I had to kill him. He was suspicious of me. He'd been suspicious of me from the start. If he kept digging, he would find out I was the one who broke into your office." And Paul pushed her away gently but firmly. "Wait, that was you?" "I was intrigued by you, Paul. I had to know more. I had to see you, hear you, know you without you seeing me. I had to be sure, Polly. I had to be sure I could trust you. Lisa, you're the one that's been coming to my window at night, aren't you?" She looked away, ashamed. "You stole my address, my phone number. You broke into my office just to what, Lisa? What did you hope to gain?" She was crying again, and when she looked up at him, he could see her honesty as she answered, "You, Paul. You're all I've ever wanted. You're all I ever hoped to gain." His blood ran cold. His breath came out in troubled gasps. He felt like someone was tearing his lungs out. How could this angel be so tainted? Criminal? Stalker? A killer? Why would you do this, Lisa? Why would you... But he stopped. She had taken his breath away again. Her hands had begun to deftly pull behind her hair, bringing her face away from it. Her perfect face had fallen away like a Halloween mask, and she had brushed away the stray strands that clung to her. As the fleshy roll hung from her neck, Paul could see a pill-shaped metal cylinder staring back at him through 2 yellow-tinted eyes. When she spoke, no mouth opened, but her voice was still Lisa's. "Because I'm not human, Paul. Because there are people who don't think I deserve a normal life." Paul took a step back, horror spreading across his face. What are you?" he breathed, his breath coming out in gasps, like someone had punched him in the stomach and never pulled their hand away. "Why, Paul, don't you remember? I'm Lisa, L model intimacy servo automaton, and I'm all yours, Polly." Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you for joining me for tonight's reading. I hope you liked tonight's story. I was in an Asimovian mood when I wrote it, and I've got a few more that I might trot out, if that sort of thing is your pleasure. It's a little more body horror than I'm used to, but I thought it might fly all right. Time to thank our backers again. Let's give another big hand for Leslie Lou Reed, our $5 Patreon contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We couldn't do it without you. If you'd like to have your name read at the end of every YouTube video, pledge $5 at our $5 tier. That's our spooky skeleton tier. Or if you'd like to support the show in another way, you can always go buy a book on Amazon, or you can just watch our channel here. We appreciate our subscribers very much. And as always, have a wonderful evening.